Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 730, and today is December 19th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Some big stories to talk about on today's show, including the assassination of a Russian general. So we will be getting into all that. But first, just want to remind people to head on over to the brand new Kyle Anzalone Show channel and subscribe to it. We just put out the 5th episode of that show this week. I think it's all going very well. I'm getting great feedback on the show, so if you haven't already, head on over and subscribe. That does help me out. Wherever you're listening to the show, audio, video, the first link in the show notes page is for the Kyle Anzalone Show. Again, if you could subscribe to that, that will definitely help me out, and I do really appreciate it. With that, let's get into today's news. First up here, Senate passes massive $895 billion National Defense Authorization Act. So on Wednesday, the Senate passed the massive $895 billion 2025 National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. The House passed the mammoth bill last week, and it now heads to President Biden's desk for a signature. So the spending bill passed the Senate by a vote of 85-14, easily getting through the 60-vote threshold it needed. The NDAA primarily funds the Pentagon and includes some spending for other government agencies, military programs, including the Department of Energy's nuclear program. While the massive NDAA, it does not account for the total U.S. military-related spending. According to veteran defense analyst Winslow Wheeler, based on the $895 billion request by the White House, the national security spending for 2025 is expected to reach $1.77 trillion, so nearly total that number. Wheeler's estimates account for military-related spending from other government agencies not funded by the NDAA, such as the Department of Veteran Affairs and Homeland Security. It also includes the national security share of the interest accrued on the U.S. debt and other factors. In recent years, Congress has authorized massive emergency supplemental spending bills to fund proxy wars overseas. In April, Biden signed the massive $95 billion supplemental that include military aid for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and the Philippines. And I wouldn't be surprised if Trump ends up signing one of those during his administration as well. Maybe more dealing with the Asia Pacific or Israel than Ukraine, but we certainly could see Trump doing one of those. All right, next up here, Ukrainian intelligence kills senior Russian general in Moscow bombing. So a senior Russian general was killed by a bomb blast in Moscow on Tuesday, and it targeted killing, Ukrainian sources said, was carried out by the Ukrainian SBU, or their intelligence agency. Lieutenant General Igor Krylov was the head of Russia's radiological, chemical, and biological defense forces and was killed alongside his assistant Igor Kryl outside a residential building in Moscow. Russian investigators say an explosive device was planted on a nearby scooter. So SBU sources told the BBC that Krylov was a legitimate target, saying he was responsible for war crimes and chemical weapons attack, which Russia denies. The Russian military says the position Krylov served in is responsible for protecting Russian forces from nuclear, chemical, and biological attacks. The British government expressed support for the assassination, saying, "We're not going to mourn the death of an individual who's propagated an illegal invasion and imposed suffering and death on the Ukrainian people," a spokesperson for the UK Prime Minister said. Russian officials are vowing a response to the assassination and plan to raise the issue at the UN Security Council. Dmitry Polonitsky, a Russian representative to the UN, said those responsible for the crimes must be duly punished and unequivocally condemned by the international community. And now, look, I think a lot of you are probably saying that, well, this is a Russian general and Russia is at war. And so it seems like he may be a legitimate target. And there's some logic to that. I'm not going to deny it. At the same time, we do have to consider how it would look if a U.S. general was assassinated somewhere in Washington, D.C., even at the height of the Iraq War by an Iraqi or some kind of other Muslim jihadist organization. Obviously, the American people would have been absolutely incensed about that. They would have demanded our government respond, and we probably would have done some really awful things in response to an event like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if Russia pursued the same course here. Now, last year, the Washington Post published a report that credited the SBU and Ukraine's military intelligence's ability to carry out targeted killings inside of Russia with the support of intelligence services it had received from the CIA since 2014. The Post report pointed to the August 2022 assassination of Daria Dugina, the daughter of a prominent Russian philosopher and herself a journalist, said her killing and similar operations involved elite teams of Ukrainian operatives drawn from directives that were formed, trained, and equipped in those in close partnership with the CIA. The CIA spends tens of millions of American dollars on the effort and helped to form a new branch of the SBU known as the 5th Directorate that was created specifically to develop groups capable of operating behind front lines and working as covert groups. The report also detailed how the CIA helped build up Ukraine's military intelligence, known as the GRU, which one former U.S. intelligence official referred to as our little baby. And so, few things on this story. One, I think it's probably a major development, and we're likely going to see a major reaction, not just at the UN, but on the Ukrainian battlefield from this. Two, apparently this Russian general, while his, specialty was in the field of chemical, radiological, biological weapons, apparently what the main thing he was doing was investigating the alleged U.S. Ukrainian biolabs that existed in Ukraine prior to the Russian invasion of that country. And so one has to wonder if the reason he was targeted was out of allegations that Russia used chemical weapons in Ukraine, which, to my understanding, I have not seen any confirmed reports that Russia used an illegal chemical weapon in Ukraine. Now, they might have used tear gas or, even extreme versions of tear gas, but, crowd dispersal type chemical weapons, non-lethal chemical weapons. I haven't heard anything about a sarin attack, even a chlorine attack or anything in that world. And so my guess is here the Ukrainians are probably, and maybe their American and British backers, also targeted this man because he had or was going to make a case that Ukraine and its backers, the U.S., were doing something that they shouldn't have been doing in those chemical biological weapons labs that existed in Ukraine prior to the invasion. Now, the last point here, of course, is even if the U.S. didn't play a direct hand in this operation, I think it's fair to assume that the Kremlin will, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong of the Kremlin to do so, given the intense U.S. support for Kiev and its intelligence agencies. And so I think it's just, important to remember here that whatever kind of response we see, at least a part of it will likely be directed at Washington. All right, next up here, we are shifting over to the Middle East, where the Israeli defense minister says Israel will occupy Gaza after the war is over. So the Israeli defense minister, that's Israel Katz, said Tuesday that the Israeli military will occupy Gaza like it does in the West Bank, even after the genocidal war comes to an end. So he said, after we defeat Hamas, military and governmental power in Gaza, Israel will have security control over Gaza with full freedom of action, just as it does in the West Bank, which he used the names Judea and Samaria, which is, the Israeli names for the occupied territory. So Katz comments come amid reports that Israel and Hamas are close to a hostage deal that would involve a temporary ceasefire. However, on Tuesday, Israeli officials told Axios that significant gaps remain and an agreement is not imminent despite optimistic statements. Hamas reportedly conceded not to seek Israeli military withdrawal as a part of the deal, but Hamas officials are saying that the proposal involved a gradual end to the Israeli military presence, meaning Katz's comments could sabotage the negotiations. According to the Middle East Eye, Israeli media reported that Israel plans to keep troops in place in Gaza to prevent displaced Palestinians from returning to northern Gaza, where the IDF has been carrying out an ethnic cleansing campaign known as the General's Plan. Israeli ministers and the Knesset members have not been shy about their desire to establish Jewish settlements in northern Gaza, and settler leaders have already gone to scout out locations. Haaretz reported on Tuesday that Israel and Saudi Arabia reached a breakthrough in normalization talks that could lead to a Gaza hostage deal, but it was swiftly denied by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That report said that Israel agreed to make some vague commitment towards a Palestinian state, which Netanyahu said was absolutely false. The Prime Minister's office explained Netanyahu has acted and is acting against the establishment of a Palestinian state that would endanger the security of Israel, his office explained. All right, next up here is an article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. This one titled, Dems Call for Blinken to Live Up to Admin's Demands of Israel, Cut Weapons Transfers to Tel Aviv. So a group of Democratic lawmakers sent a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken demanding the administration follow through with threats to cut weapon transfers to Israel if Tel Aviv did not allow more aid into the Strip. Since early October, northern Gaza has been under a total siege and deprived of nearly all aid deliveries. The letter, led by Reps Greg Cesar and Summer Lee, said that the White House must cut offensive weapon sales to Israel. Quote, simply put, the Netanyahu government has not complied with the United States' repeated request to allow more humanitarian aid to be delivered safely to innocent people. Under U.S. law, the U.S. government must suspend offensive weapons to any nation that fails to meet these basic standards. Now, of course, they use the phrase offensive weapons there, which could be used by the Biden administration to give them a pretty wide breadth of actions that they could take. Offensive weapons only count 2,000-pound bombs. For whatever reason, 500-pound bombs are defensive. They could use this kind of twisted logic. So we shouldn't assume that this is really talking about like an arms embargo on Israel. However, any step in this direction would be positive. So a total of 20 lawmakers signed on to the Cesar Lee letter. The letter is referring to a set of demands issued by Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to Tel Aviv in October. That letter, sent from the secretaries to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, gave Israel 30 days to improve the flow of aid into Gaza. The deadline passed without Israel meeting its secretary's demands, as the letter explained. For example, your administration wrote that Israel must enable a minimum of 350 humanitarian aid trucks per day to enter Gaza. In the 30 days following the release of the Biden administration letter, an average of only 42 trucks entered Gaza daily, with as few as 6 trucks entering on some days. This represents a massive failure that is costing people their lives. And think about that. You request an ally to do something, and not only do they didn't even meet us halfway. That's less than a seventh of the aid, that just over 10% of the aid that we asked them to allow in, they allowed in. That should be seen as an absolute slap in the face to the White House, an insult. How dare a country that we are giving $20 billion in arms to this year not meet a basic demand just to allow a few hundred aid trucks into a starving population a day. And in fact, they continue to cut and curtail aid. As Americans, we should all be insulted and infuriated with Israel that they could somehow take this much of our money and still deny our request. So, Israel is in the process of ethnic cleansing northern Gaza. According to the United Nations, the Netanyahu government has denied 82 out of 91 attempts since October 6th, 2024, to deliver aid to cut off areas in northern Gaza. During the 30-day time period provided to Israel, roughly 100,000 displaced people were displaced from the region. And so they're explaining in the letter how awful things are, particularly for the people in northern Gaza. So Tel Aviv relies on Washington as the U.S. is Israel's leading supplier of weapons and could not continue to wage this multi-front war without the American assistance, which doesn't appear to be ending anytime soon. All right, another article from the Libertarian Institute that I wrote this week. Al-Qaeda linked Jolani meets with British diplomats, discusses removal from terror list. So the leader of Al-Qaeda linked Syrian rebel group that removed President Bashar al-Assad from power met with British officials to request the removal of sanctions and the terror designation from his group. So Abu Mohammed al-Jolani met with Stephen Hinkie, the director of Middle East Department at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and then Anne Snow, the UK's envoy to Damascus, on Monday. According to the statements given to Middle East Eye, officials from Jolani's Harit Tahrir al-Sham said the talks discussed the latest developments in Syria without providing any other details. The UK's foreign ministry stated that the British officials discussed London's role in Damascus's transition of power from Assad. Jolani also gave an interview to the British outlet The Times to press for sanctions relief. He said, countries must now lift this designation. Syria is very important geostrategically. They should lift all restrictions which were imposed on the flogger and the victim. The flogger is now gone. This is not an issue up for negotiations. So Jolani, who fought for Al-Qaeda in Iraq against American soldiers, added that HTS's designation as a foreign terrorist group was inappropriate. HTS has been labeled a terror organization by Washington and London since 2017, when Jolani created the group. At the time, both governments recognized that HTS was merely a rebranding of Al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate group Al-Nusra. Following Jolani's triumph, the White House and 10 Downing Street are now considering removing HTS and Jolani from the terror list. In recent years, Jolani has attempted to soften his image by sitting down with Western journalists for interviews, often appearing in a suit and with a trimmed beard, in an attempt to obscure his jihadist ideology. Jolani's meetings with British government and media come on the heels of London using the Terrorism Act 2000 to target and frame supporters of Palestinian rights as aiding Hamas. London said last week that engagement with HTS would not violate the law. And this again is the case of our governments actively working against us, the people from their countries, right? Where Hamas, is a group that is dedicated to ruling Gaza one and the liberation of the Palestinian people, the establishment of some kind of Palestinian state. HTS is an international terrorist organization, and while it officially broke ties with Al-Qaeda in 2016, this was done in coordination with the Al-Qaeda leadership in order to get more U.S. support. So the idea that we're going to allow meetings with HTS, which is an Al-Qaeda linked group, and we're going to condemn people for merely saying positive things about the Palestinians, potentially prosecute them in the UK, and say they are pro-terrorism, if they are pro-Hamas, which they're really not even pro-Hamas, they're just pro-Palestinian. But using that argument, even if they were pro-Hamas, it still should be far more offensive to be pro-HTS than it is to be pro-Hamas, but that is not the case. And it's because one is a sock puppet of the American government who helped to overthrow a dictator in the Middle East, who, yes, was a brutal dictator, was a bad man, Bashar al-Assad, but at the same time had no interest, no eyes on attacking the U.S., and we replaced him with a man who is a Al-Qaeda fighter. All right. Next up here, HTS's leader Jolani says Syria won't be used as launchpad to attack Israel. So the leader of the Al-Qaeda offshoot HTS, which is leading Syria, followed the regime change that ousted Bashar al-Assad, has said that Syria would not become a launchpad to attack Israel. He explained, "We do not want any conflict, whether with Israel or anyone else, and we will not let Syria be used as a launchpad for attacks." Netanyahu has celebrated and took credit for the HTS takeover of Syria, since Assad was a major ally of Iran and Hezbollah. But Israel has also bombed Syria over 800 times and invaded southern Syria, taking over some Syrian territory, including the buffer zone that separates Israel and the occupied Golan Heights from the rest of Syria. Jolani, who has been using his real name, Ahmad al-Shara, called for Israel to withdraw from Syria and respect the 1974 ceasefire agreement that established a buffer zone, which is patrolled by UN peacekeepers known as UNDOF. Jolani said, "We are committed to the 1974 peace agreement, and we are prepared to return the UN monitors." The U.S. has been in direct contact with HTS, despite the group being a U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization and Jolani having a $10 million bounty on his head. Despite the fact that Jolani founded Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria, which merged with several other factions to create HTS in 2017, the U.S. has shown a clear preference for him over Assad. Jolani began rebranding his group in 2016, claiming his former group, the Al-Nusra Front, was cutting ties with Al-Qaeda. At the time, Jolani thanked commanders of Al-Qaeda for having understood the need to break ties. Since then, he has been presenting himself as a moderate in order to gain support from the West. Unfortunately, it worked. All right. So next up here, let's look at the Israeli invasion of Syria. Report: Netanyahu orders IDF to occupy Syria's Mount Hermon until end of 2025. So the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered the military to occupy territory it captured on Mount Hermon in Syria following the downfall of Bashar al-Assad until at least the end of next year. After Assad fled Syria on December 8th, Israel invaded southern Syria, taking control of the buffer zone that separated the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights from the rest of the Syrian territory. However, the Israeli military went even further and captured territory beyond the buffer zone. The Channel 12 report said at least a year-long occupation of southern Syria is significant because it essentially opens up a new front for the IDF forces. Netanyahu visited the Israeli troops on Mount Hermon on Tuesday and made it clear they weren't going anywhere anytime soon, saying the occupation will continue until a new agreement is made. Following the downfall of Assad, the Israeli cabinet also approved a plan to expand settlements in the area of the Golan Heights that had been occupied since 1967. The purpose of this plan is to significantly increase the Jewish settler population in the area. So Netanyahu said in a statement on the cabinet's approval of the plan to expand the settlements, "Strengthening the Golan is strengthening the state of Israel, and it especially is important at this time. We will continue to hold on to it, cause it to blossom, and settle in." Israel formally annexed the Golan Heights in 1981, a move not recognized by any country until the Trump administration did so in 2019. Now we also have a Turkish invasion of Syria underway. Turkey masses troops on Syrian border. Large-scale invasion may be imminent. This one from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. So Jason writes, though it has reportedly been extended until the end of the week, the failure to make the ceasefire between the Turkish-backed forces and the U.S.-backed Kurdish SDF permanent is expected to lead to more fighting. It is starting to look like the fight for northern Syria could be much bigger than anyone expected, as Turkey is massing troops along the border. Turkish forces have been building up on the border in an area near Kobani in recent days and are now reported to be strategically positioned at a site along the Syrian border. Turkey is said to want about 30 kilometers or about 18.5-mile buffer zone across the entire southern border with Syria, and with help from its allies, the Syrian National Army, it may be close to achieving that goal. It might not stop there, though. So Jason is saying that they could take even more territory, and at least some of the SNA guys are the Al-Qaeda linked members of the HTS. So U.S. officials are suggesting that a massive incursion is likely from Turkey and is probably imminent, judging by the positioning of the troops. The target is presumably Syria's northeast, which is held by the U.S.-backed Kurdish forces, or the SDF. This isn't a surprise, as Turkey has long been hostile to the SDF. Over the weekend, Turkish foreign minister said Turkey has a strategic goal of the elimination of the Kurdish YPG, which the YPG is essentially the largest fighting force and the most effective fighting force and the ruling fighting force over the SDF. So the YPG, the Turkish group, really does control this territory, and through, with the backing of America as their proxy force. So this isn't Turkey has a history of launching incursions into Syria to try to tamp down Kurdish ambitions to set up an autonomous zone in the northeast. U.S. officials likened the current buildup to the Turkish invasion in 2019 against the SDF. Signs are this will be an even bigger invasion. The timing is also noteworthy. Turkey has just put a great deal of effort into the regime change in Syria, which led to the installation of HTS as the new government. Turkey has been backing HTS, and HTS officials have been talking about the need to eliminate the separatist impulses of the Kurdish factions in the northeast. Since the regime change, fighting over territory in Syria has been growing. Israel has been seizing areas in the southwest, and it seems likely Turkey is hoping to take advantage of the instability to gain deeper control over the Kurdish parts of Syria, which Kurdish officials call Rojava, and I wouldn't be surprised if Turkey is planning on annexing at least a chunk of Syrian territory through all of this. The U.S. interest in Rojava is officially that the SDF is fighting against ISIS remnant forces. However, that interest also hinges on U.S.-friendly factions controlling Syria's oil fields and gas regions. President-elect Donald Trump ditched support for the SDF the last time Turkey launched a substantial incursion in 2019. With him returning to power in just a few weeks, Turkey likely sees U.S. backing of the Kurds as doubtful. And Trump made statements similar to this, which basically it's not worth it to lose U.S. troops in order to defend this Syrian territory, and that Erdogan wants it really bad. All right, next up here, Israel passing messages to Syria's HTS, but Turkey's influence is a concern. So both Israel and Turkey are at the forefront of this month's regime change in Syria. The takeover of Syria by HTS alters the landscape of the region, but Turkey and Israel may quickly find themselves at odds on who's really calling the shots. Israel has been engaged with HTS, though officials say they're passing messages and are not in direct contact with them. HTS leader Jolani has been loudly trying to reassure Israel that Syria won't be used as a launchpad for attacks on that country. HTS efforts to curry favor with Israel began even before the offensive ended with the taking of Damascus, but the level of influence Tel Aviv can expect to have pales in comparison with that of Turkey. Turkey very openly backed the HTS-led invasion, and Jolani says that Turkey and Syria will now have close strategic relations. Moreover, Jolani said that Turkey will have priority over all countries in the reconstruction of Syria. While Israel's goal was to see Syria removed from the Iranian alliance of nations, it's not much more comfortable with Syria becoming a client state of Turkey. Turkey is another regional rival for Israel, albeit one with such overt hostility as Iran. Israel's opposition leader Yair Golan expressed concern today that Turkey might end up being too dominant in Syria. He couched this mostly as concern that Sunni Islamists dominating Syria, though that clearly wasn't a problem for Israel during HTS's takeover, but also end up being a call to bad Syrian Kurds to prevent Turkey from moving against them. And so this could be a part of what Israel's plan has been for Syria all along, which was never to have a victor in the Syrian civil war. Their hope was that the Syrian war would just go on and on and on and on. And Israel says, both of our enemies are being weakened by these Sunni Islamists fighting against Bashar al-Assad's government. Now, they did also say that if one of those two sides was going to prevail, they preferred the jihadists to Bashar al-Assad. So, the side that they wanted to win did win. They were just preferring that the game continues to be played, the war continues to be fought. Now, if they still want war to be raging in Syria, the two factions that would be fighting that war would be the Syrian Kurds and the Turkish-backed HTS. And so maybe that's what Israel wants right now, and that's what they're going to be agitating for, the U.S. to go to war with HTS on behalf of the Syrian Kurds, and Lindsey Graham is already agitating for that as well. All right, everyone, that's the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. Thank you.